This video is sponsored by my new music theory course that's available right now at artmaster.com. Music theory is effectively a language that musicians can use to communicate ideas to each other. And what's the best way to get better at speaking a language? Expanding your vocabulary. So today we're going to look at 101 music theory terms, starting with conjunct. If a melody is conjunct, it moves by step up and down the scale. With a little help from my friend has a conjunct melody. The opposite of conjunct is disjunct, a melody that doesn't take steps up and down the scale, but instead takes leaps. For example, the melody of Here, There and Everywhere is disjunct. Now, just a moment ago, we mentioned the word scale. A scale is a set of notes, usually ordered by lowest to highest in pitch, which we group together to evoke a certain sound. Most scales in Western music are built from 7 different notes, separated by a series of tones and semitones. A semitone is the smallest distance between any 2 notes in typical Western music. For example, between B and C is a semitone, or between C and C sharp is also a semitone. But of course, semi means half, so a semitone is half of a tone effectively being 2 semitones. The interval, for example, between C and D, or B flat and C, that's a tone. Now, a moment ago when I was talking about tones and semitones, I used the word interval. An interval is the relative space between 2 pitches. For example, the interval between the note C and the next note named C in the scale is an octave. Or the interval between the note C and the note G above it is a perfect fifth. Different intervals have different levels of consonance and dissonance. If an interval is consonant, like the perfect fifth, it sounds harmonious to us. The 2 notes sort of marry together into this very pleasing sound. But if an interval is dissonant, like a tritone for example, the 2 notes clash together, making our ears yearn for a resolution. And if you're wondering, the reason that a tritone is called a tritone is because it's literally 3 tones. If we take intervals like the tritone or the perfect fifth and we stack them up, we wind up with what's called a chord. A chord is 3 or more notes played together to create a sense of harmony. The most common type of chord is a triad, a 3-note chord. A major chord is an example of a triad. And as we can see, it's just a stack of intervals, a major third and then a minor third on top. Another common type of triad is the minor triad or minor chord, which is also a stack of major and minor thirds, but the other way round. This time the minor third is on the bottom. Chords are an example of harmony, when notes are played together to create a sense of movement or colour. And most harmony in Western music is built by stacking thirds, in what's called tertiary harmony, tertiary obviously meaning third. We can alternatively though have quartal harmony, chords built from fourths rather than thirds. For example, we can see some quartal harmony in Herbie Hancock's Maiden Voyage. Now, if we take a chord and rather than playing the notes all at once, we play them one after another, that's called an arpeggio. For example, the song Clocks by Coldplay opens with these arpeggios played on the piano. These arpeggiated chords are forming the opening riff of this song, the opening piano riff. A riff is a short repeated melodic phrase used throughout a song. And of course, when I say melodic, I mean it's like a melody, it's a short melody. Melody, unlike harmony, is notes played in order, resulting in what you might call a tune, or something you could hum along to. Now, the term riff is quite closely associated with pop and rock music. The classical equivalent of the word riff would probably be ostinato. An ostinato is a repeating pattern or phrase that sort of underpins a piece of music. For example, the iconic 5/4 marching ostinato from Gustav Holst's Mars. A motif is a short reoccurring phrase or idea that's used almost as a building block to a melody. Perhaps the most famous motif of all time is... Now, as I said, motifs are often treated like building blocks, small fragments of a melody that we can then adapt to create a full melody. And one way that we can adapt the motif is with sequence. Sequence is when we repeat a motif, but either at a higher or lower pitch to where we previously heard it. For example, we could also diminish the motif. To diminish a motif or a melody is to cut all of the note values in half like this. But of course, as you might be aware, diminish can mean more than just this in music. Diminish is one of those terms that has several uses in music. We just saw what diminishing a melody looks like, or what we can call diminution, but we can also diminish an interval. If we took our fifth interval, our perfect fifth, and lowered the top note, in this example lowered G down to G flat, we have now got a diminished fifth. Diminished, of course, meaning to make smaller. So in the case of the melody, we were making the note values smaller, and in the case of the fifth, we were making the interval smaller. We can also have a diminished chord or a diminished triad. This is a chord that's built from a diminished fifth interval. A similar musical term is augmented. Augment, of course, meaning the opposite of diminish, to make larger. Just like with diminish, we can have an augmented melody or an augmented phrase by doubling the note value, in other words, making the melody last twice as long. We can have an augmented fifth, and just like with diminished, we can have an augmented chord or an augmented triad. Another musical term that has various different applications is inversion. If we're talking in terms of melodies and motifs, we can invert a motif by effectively flipping it upside down, the same intervals but just going in the opposite direction. So that's inverting a melody, but we can also invert a chord. To invert a chord, we take its lowest note and we place it at the top instead, giving us the same three notes and thus the same chord, but with a different note at the bottom, which effectively changes its character. And yet another musical term that has various different meanings is modulation. If you're thinking more in terms of music production, then modulation actually refers to things like a chorus effect or a phaser. But in music theory, a modulation effectively means a key change, moving from one key to another. And the most effective and simple way to do this, to modulate from one key to another, is using a cadence. A cadence is like a short chord progression or a short phrase that acts to resolve or complete a musical sentence. The most common type of cadence is an authentic cadence, or what the British call a perfect cadence. The movement from the fifth chord of the key, the dominant chord, to the first chord of the key, the tonic chord. If we wanted to modulate, for example, from the key of C to the key of D, all we really have to do is play an authentic cadence in that destination key of D major, like this. So here we have modulated from the key of C to the key of D. However, if we didn't want to fully modulate, fully change key, and instead just wanted to dip our toe in another key before returning back home, we could use what's called tonicization. Tonicization is when we treat a chord that's not the tonic chord as if it is the tonic chord, effectively creating a very brief key change or modulation. For example, here, Bach temporarily treats the D chord here as the tonic chord as a point of resolution, despite us being in the key of G. But this is only a tonicization, not a modulation, because immediately after this point of resolution on the D chord, we continue back in the key of G major. Tonicizations are achieved by using a secondary dominant chord. We mentioned before that the dominant chord is the fifth chord of the key, while the secondary dominant is the fifth chord of one of the other chords in the key. So to achieve his tonicization here, Bach has used the dominant chord of the D major chord, the fifth chord of D major, which is A major. So by using it here, he temporarily treats the D chord like the tonic. Recently, I've made a music theory course with Artmaster here in Prague, and I think it's a fantastic course for anybody who wants to learn music theory from the ground up. We go from the absolute beginning of music theory and then build it up, learning about chords, chord progressions, different scales, the beginnings of reading notation, time signatures. If you've ever been watching one of my videos and you think, wait a minute, what was that you just said? This is the course for you. It's a brilliant way to lay that foundation so you can learn more and more about music theory. If you're interested, do check out the links down below in the description. So that's modulation and tonicization, but what if we wanted to change the key of a piece of music before we even started playing it? Perhaps the original version is in a key too high for us to sing and we want to lower the key. Well, that's referred to as transposing, rewriting the music out in a different key. Now, a word I've been using a lot so far but not actually explained is key. What is a key? Well, the key of a piece of music is effectively its gravitational centre. Where does the music want to resolve back to? If music's in the key of C major, then it has a tendency to want to resolve back to the note C, to the tonic note. And when we play music that just stays within the key, it's described as diatonic. Diatonic means to play within the key. If we chose instead to play outside of the key, well, now we would be playing chromatically. The note G flat, for example, in the key of C is a chromatic note. It doesn't belong in the key. And if we wanted to write this down on a piece of sheet music, we would write it like this, with a little flat symbol before the G to indicate that this is not the normal G that's in the key, it's a chromatic note. And this little flat here is an example of an accidental. An accidental is when during the course of a piece of music, we want to use a chromatic note, so we use either a flat, sharp, or natural symbol like this to indicate that that note will not be within the normal key or scale. Now, we notated our note here as G flat, but we could have alternatively notated it as F sharp. Both G flat and F sharp are actually the same pitch, the same key on our piano. These two notes are what we refer to as enharmonic, effectively two different spellings, two different names of the same pitch. Now, G flat in the context of C is what we can refer to as a blue note, particularly if we're playing jazz or rock or blues music. Using some chromatic notes from outside of the scale can give it a bluesy flavour, that sort of dissonant yet satisfying sound, and these notes are referred to as blue notes. We might throw a blue note into a lick. A lick is a short melodic phrase used as a building block of a larger melody or solo, and the term lick is closely associated with blues, rock and jazz music. Now, there are certain music theory terms that only really get used in jazz. For example, if we were sat at the piano playing chords accompanying the saxophone player as he soloed, well, we would be comping, comping being slang for accompanying. We might be comping just by going back and forth between two chords in what we could call a vamp. A vamp is a repeated short chord progression, often played on an indefinite loop until we get a cue from someone else to move to the next section of the music. Or we might instead be comping by going through the changes. The changes are the chord changes of the piece of music we're playing. When we improvise a solo in jazz music, we usually do it over the chord changes of the head. The head is the main melody of the jazz standard that we're playing. Many jazz songs are in what's called a head arrangement, where we open by playing a famous and recognizable tune, and then we go through the chord changes of that tune again, but instead of playing the recognizable melody, we instead have each band member take turns improvising a solo over those changes. Now, something that's quite common to do in jazz music with a chord progression is to reharmonize it. So you've taken this famous jazz standard, but rather than playing the chords that were used in the original version, you swap some of those chords, you reharmonize the melody, giving it a different quality. A common way to reharmonize in jazz music is what's called a tritone substitution. A tritone substitution is when we substitute or swap out one of the chords for the same chord a tritone away. This is most commonly done with the fifth chord of the key. So, for example, in the key of C major, we would be substituting our G7 chord for a D flat 7 chord. And what allows this to work is that both those chords, G7 and D flat 7, both contain the same tritone, so they both have the same effective resolution back to the tonic chord. Another very important element of jazz music is swing. Swing is when the notes in the rhythm aren't lasting for identical periods of time. When a rhythm does feature notes that are all identical in length, this is called straight. In practice, different musicians will play around with the timing of the rhythm to get different swing feels. But one type of swing is what we call a shuffle. A shuffle is where the eighth notes are not straight anymore, but instead they are the first and last notes of a triplet, giving us this rolling, shuffling sound. A triplet is where we have 3 notes in the space where we would usually have 2 notes. A triplet is an example of a tuplet. A tuplet is when we're playing more or less notes in a space than we would usually have. For example, if we played 5 notes in a space where we would usually only have 4 notes, well, that's a quintuplet. Or if we played 7 notes in the space where we normally would only have 4 notes, we now have a septuplet. However, the triplet is by far the most common type of tuplet that you'll encounter. If we have music that's based on a triplet feel throughout, then we can describe that music as having a compound time signature. A compound time signature is where each beat of the bar is effectively a dotted quarter note, i.e. we have 3 eighth notes, or the equivalent of a triplet, on each beat of the bar, giving the music that shuffling sound. 6/8 and 12/8 are examples of compound time signatures. Now, a time signature is the amount of beats we have in each bar of the music, and can also be described as a meter. And of course, a bar is a small unit of music. For example, in the time signature of 4/4, which is the most common time signature that we'll encounter, each bar of the music has 4 beats in it. 4/4 is such a common choice of time signature that it's sometimes actually just referred to as common time, and can be symbolized by the C symbol rather than the full 4/4 symbol. We can also have what's called cut time, which is symbolized by a C with a line through it, and is the equivalent of 2/2 time. So the same as 4/4 really, but rather than feeling each quarter note in the bar as our prevailing beat, as the thing we tap our foot to, we're instead latching on to 2 half notes each bar. The half note is the beat that we're perceiving. Now, our time signature sits on these 5 horizontal lines, what are called the stave, or the staff. The lines and spaces on this stave represent different notes, different pitches, and we know which pitches they represent by looking at the clef. If we have a treble clef, for example, we know that the pitches in the spaces of the stave will be F, A, C, E, like that, and that the pitches on the lines will be E, G, B, D, and F. Now let's talk about some other symbols that we might encounter on notation. For example, this symbol, which is called a simile. The word simile means the same, so a simile symbol in music means that we should play the same thing that happened in the previous bar. This symbol is a fermata, and it means that we should hesitate on that note. The performer should drag that note out. The tempo of a piece of music is the speed at which we play it. The tempo will be written on a piece of music using a tempo mark like this, where it tells us the BPM, how many beats we should play per minute. If a piece of music is not played at a fixed tempo, it's said to be in free time. Rubato is when a piece of music is largely in a fixed tempo, but the performer allows the tempo to swell, to speed up and slow down expressively, which is a very common thing to do in classical music. Now, even if a piece of music isn't using rubato and is instead in a fixed tempo, a consistent tempo, we might want that piece of music to slow down at the end to give it a nice sense of conclusion. And this can be described with 2 different terms: ritardando, which means to slow down, usually to then stop, or rallentando, which also means to slow down and is often also used at the end of a phrase or a piece of music. Now, when we have notes on a piece of notation, we'll often have different symbols telling us how exactly we should play those notes, what articulation we should use. For example, if we have a dot above or below the note head, then we should play that note staccato, meaning to play it with a short, snappy rhythm, preventing the notes from ringing after we've played them. Or we might have the opposite of staccato. We might want to be playing it legato, where we're sort of slurring each note into the next, so you can't really tell where one ends and the next begins. This is indicated with a line like this, a slur line. We might want to accent a certain note to show that that note has rhythmic importance. We might also get these little notes before the main notes. These are called grace notes. A very brief grace note is referred to as an acciaccatura. This is a note perhaps only a semitone or a tone away from the true destination note to add a little bit of colour and tension before we get the main note. This type of grace note will be depicted by a small note with a line through it. A longer grace note is what's referred to as an appoggiatura. This grace note is held longer to create a suspension. The appoggiatura sits on a non-chord note, a note that's not in the chord, and then resolves onto the true melody note which is in the chord, creating a sense of tension and release. Appoggiaturas won't always be notated as little grace notes. They'll sometimes be notated in normal notes. An example of an appoggiatura is the melody from Yesterday, where we open on a non-chord note and then resolve down onto the chord note. Grace notes are examples of ornaments, small decorative additions to the main melody that are sometimes notated and sometimes added at the performer's own discretion. A common type of ornament is a trill, a quick pivoting back and forth between the main melody note and an adjacent note. And this trill won't be notated out note for note, we'll just have this symbol here to indicate to the performer that they should perform a trill. Or we might have a turn. A turn is asking us to start by playing the note that's actually notated, then play a note one above in the scale, return to the main melody note, then play a note below in the scale, and then once again return to the main melody note. This is done in very quick succession, creating a little decorative turn of the note. And just like the trill, this isn't notated out, it's instead indicated with this symbol. Another type of ornament is a mordant. This is like a half version of a turn. In an upper mordant, we play the note that's notated, then quickly go up one note and then return to the note that was notated. And in a lower mordant, we do the opposite. We play the notated note, go down one note and return back to the notated note, all so quickly that we don't really perceive the individual notes, we just hear this decorative ornament effect. A word I've used a lot so far but not actually defined is rhythm. Rhythm is pitches or notes played in time, the relative time between the different notes. So now let's have a look at some other rhythm-related music theory terms. For example, a flam. A flam is when we get two quick notes, usually on a percussion instrument, in quick succession, so close to each other that we're almost perceiving them as one note. This is a common thing to do, for example, on a snare drum. This is a single hit on a snare drum, and this is a flam on a snare drum. A push in music, if we push the rhythm of a piece of music, is when we effectively land on the next beat of the bar earlier than we should have. So for example, if we land on this D minor chord, not on the main beat, not on the downbeat of the bar, but instead here, we have pushed that beat. The downbeat is the first beat of the bar, what you might describe as the one. And it's described as the downbeat because when a conductor is conducting, as their hand or their baton moves downwards towards the floor, it's indicating the first beat of the bar, the downbeat. The offbeats are the weaker beats in the bar. For example, in 4/4 time, beat number 2 and beat number 4 are considered offbeats. If we emphasize these offbeats using the snare drum of the drum kit, this is called a backbeat, one of the essential parts to the classic rock drum beat. And a skank is a term from reggae and ska music describing a guitar rhythm where we play upstrokes of chords on the offbeat. If we have a rhythm that actively avoids playing on the main beats of the bar, particularly the downbeat, we can say that that rhythm is syncopated. For example, most of the notes of this rhythm don't land on the main beats of the bar, meaning that it's syncopated. If a melody begins before the downbeat, effectively before the first bar of the music, it's said to have an anacrusis, or a pickup. For example, the melody of Happy Birthday has an anacrusis. These two opening notes happen before the first downbeat of the song. So far, I've given definitions for 3 of the 6 main elements of music. The 3 that we've looked at so far are harmony, melody, and rhythm. but there are three other key elements to music, and one of them is dynamics. Dynamics is the relative loudness or softness of a piece of music. On sheet music, dynamics are notated using these little F and P symbols. F indicating the word forte, the Italian word for loud, and piano meaning soft, the Italian word for soft. And if you're wondering why there's an instrument called a piano, if piano means soft, well, it's because originally when the piano was invented, it was called the pianoforte, an instrument that, unlike its predecessor the harpsichord, could simultaneously play softly, piano, and loudly, forte, pianoforte. So dynamics is the fourth main element of music. The fifth main element of music is timbre. Timbre is the particular character of a note, and can be best described as the difference between a piano playing the note A and a violin playing the exact same note A. Although both of these instruments are playing the exact same note, they sound different, and that sound is their timbre, the unique characteristics of each instrument. The sixth and final fundamental element of music is texture. Texture is the different layers that a piece of music has, the different interacting parts that create the sum of that music. The most basic texture we could have is monophonic texture, when a piece of music is comprised of simply just one line of music, unaccompanied by anything else. If we were to add other lines to this music together, then we could describe it as polyphonic. And if these other lines that we added worked together to create a sense of chords and harmony together, we would describe it as homophonic. Homo meaning the same, so these different lines of music, despite being separate, are acting together to create one cohesive sense of harmony, homophonic. Now let's finish off by just ticking off a few other music theory terms that I haven't covered yet. A glissando is when we smoothly move from one note to another, without any discernible fringe between the two different notes. For example, Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin opens with this iconic clarinet glissando. A very similar idea to a glissando is a portamento. Portamento is where, rather than stepping from one note to the next, we sort of glide between the two. The difference between portamento and glissando, though, is whereas glissando is a very deliberate and obvious slide between two notes where we spend an extended period of time between the two notes, a portamento is more of an ornamentation, a small glide at the end of the note that guides us into the next note, so the main duration of that note was not sliding. Tremolo is when the volume of a note quickly fluctuates, creating this sort of fluttering sound. This is sometimes achieved, for example, with a tremolo guitar pedal. A term that often gets muddled up with tremolo is vibrato. Unlike tremolo, which is a fluctuation in the volume of the note, vibrato is a fluctuation in the pitch of the note, creating a similar but different fluttering sound. Vibrato, for example, is what you would achieve by using the whammy bar on your guitar. And our final music theory term today will be a cappella. A cappella means vocal music that's unaccompanied by any other instrument. A cappella is literally the Italian for in the style of the chapel, i.e. the sort of music you would sing in a church or chapel. And remember to watch out, because a cappella is not one word as you sometimes see it written down as. It is two words. A cappella. If you can think of any important terms that I've missed out, do leave them in the comments down below, and maybe I'll do a follow-up video to this.